Hello!
The things some people will do for clicks and likes. Alright, welcome back everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the ideas of biodiversity and how we humans impact the environment, and a way to memorize the major ways that we impact that environment. But before we discuss our impacts on biodiversity, first we need to talk about what is biodiversity, this diversity of life, and why it's important that we preserve this biodiversity and we should be concerned that is decreasing over time. One of the big benefits of biodiversity is obviously ecosystem stability. That when we talk about food webs, all these organisms are intricately connected with each other. So when you remove one link, the entire ecosystem could actually collapse. An example of that is known as a keystone species, where this species is so important to that local ecosystem that its removal can have dramatic and drastic effects on the survival of all the other organisms in that ecosystem. A great example of that is a sea otter. Without the otter, you can see at the food web on the bottom right that the entire ecosystem, the entire food web would be very different, and you have overpopulation of some organisms and underpopulations of another. Another great example is beavers and how they dam the river, and they can affect the local ecosystem in that entire area. Without a beaver, without that dam, too much water can go through certain rivers, cause certain insects to die off, so they have a critical importance to these local ecosystems. A second benefit is obviously the benefits that people obtain from the actual ecosystem itself. And then the third benefit is looking at our own use of biodiversity for medical and industrial and agricultural purposes. So many of the new medicines we find, we don't randomly find in a lab. We find the chemical already present within another population, and then we isolate it and then modify it slightly to benefit us. But without biodiversity, we're losing all of the sources of new medical advances, new industrial advances, new agricultural advances. So without the organisms already designing this stuff on their own, we are not smart enough to come up with many of these chemicals and these solutions completely by ourselves. We require nature to basically provide us a scaffold, and then we can modify and isolate as we see fit. So how are you possibly going to remember the major ways that humans impact the environment? And the simple way is to memorize HIPCO, HIPPCO, which lists the 6 major ways that humans affect the environment, in order of importance in terms of the most major impact to the least major impact. So it's an acronym, so each letter stands for a certain activity that we do to affect the ecosystem. The first one being H, that stands for habitat destruction or habitat fragmentation. This is the number one threat to ecosystems, the number one threat to species. You can see at the picture at the bottom where if we are cutting large amounts of trees, especially in the rainforest where there's many species that we don't even know exist, that we're obviously going to damage those local areas and many species are going to go extinct. The second way that we impact the environment is through the introduction of invasive or non-native species. So we're moving species from areas where they are not normally found, where they are normally found, into areas where they're not normally found. And obviously, a great example of invasive species in Florida is the Burmese python in the Everglades. Pythons are not meant to be in the Everglades, yet someone decided to have a pet. It got released, and now they're a major nuisance in the Everglades. There's many examples. You have mites that were carried over from Asia that have affected our honeybee population, which then led to we brought over Africanized honeybees, aka African killer bees, to replace our natural honeybee population. But unfortunately, that didn't actually work either, so they're invasive, no less. You have the example of the fire ants. And you can see in 1918 that the fire ants were a very small area. However, by 2000, they've spread over the entire southeastern United States. And one of the big issues with invasive species is that since they're not natural to that area, they don't really have many things controlling their population size. They don't have those natural predators. So what usually happens and why they're so bad is they're not usually actively killing off the native species. They're basically just out competing them. Kind of the idea of the competitive exclusion principle, where you have these two organisms that are competing. One of them is going to be more equipped to survive in that environment. And since there's no natural predators of that invasive species, it's going to get more of the resources that it needs for its survival, and therefore decrease the amount of resources for the native species, and that's what causes their extinction, is that the invasive species, the non-native species, just outcompete them for resources. Kudzo is another example. It's known as the vine that ate the South. So this vine was brought in. Many invasive species were brought in for actual useful purposes. So Kudzo was brought into the southeastern United States to control erosion. Well, unfortunately, once again, no natural predators. So you can see in the picture, it just grows and grows and grows and doesn't stop. There is nothing to really stop it. So the amount of money that now we have to spend to control these kudzo population to make sure it doesn't spiral completely out of control and just consume everything in the area is in the billions of dollars. A more or less useful example would be the European starling. Some bonehead had this great idea that he was going to bring in every bird mentioned in Shakespeare's plays into the United States. And unfortunately, he was too successful, and he brought in too many of them, one of them being the European starling. So you can see that he released in the late 1800s by just one guy who wanted to bring in all these birds from Shakespeare, and now they're found over all of North America. So just a few of them in New York City in the late 1800s now spread, and now they're common all over the entire country. And you see the big issue is that they're outcompeting many native birds, such as bluebirds, for nest holes. So they're taking over these ecosystems, so the other native birds don't have any place to actually live. The third letter is the P, stands for population growth, which is looking at human population growth. So the idea of as we increase our population, just the pure amount of resources that we take for our survival and our species survival is obviously causing major impacts on the environment. Because look at this picture of the beach. What native species could possibly live in that area now? We've just completely taken over these natural ecosystems where there's just literally no room now for many of these species to survive. The second P stands for pollution. There's many examples of pollution. You have cultural eutrophication with the use of too much fertilizer causing damage in our lakes and ponds. You have DDT, which is now banned in this country. It was a pesticide that was found to actually cause the shells of certain birds, the shells on the outside of the eggs of certain birds, to become too soft. So when the mom bird sat on it, it actually cracked the egg, and you can see it almost led to the extinction of bald eagles and some other predatory birds. But obviously pollution is a large example, especially when you talk about the different power plants and the different amount of things that we burn and the amount of pollutants that just come out of burning many different compounds and chemicals. The C stands for climate change, which is very self-explanatory, the idea of the greenhouse effect, and too much greenhouse gases cause temperature changes, which you can see the rising temperatures has caused loss of sea ice. And if the sea ice is gone, the polar bear can't just swim all the time. It needs some place to stand. So if there's no ice anymore, then the polar bear has no place to stand and live, so they're going to go extinct. Same thing is happening in coral reefs. We already mentioned with ocean acidification that we're damaging many of these reefs and causing irreparable harm to these reefs over time. And then the final way that we impact the environment, the O, stands for overharvesting or overpoaching or overexploitation. This idea that we're just overusing our resources, that instead of taking 2 fish, we take 50 fish. So we're just taking too many resources that we can't afford to consume more than that's being replaced. So, I mean, fishing is fine, but if you're taking so many fish that the natural populations can't reproduce quickly enough, then you're going to cause a massive decline in those natural populations, and eventually they'll go extinct. I mean, overfishing is a very large issue with cod and Atlantic salmon and red snapper. Chilean sea bass has been hunted to the point of extremely low population levels that even if it's legal, but just you're collecting too much, you're overexploiting these resources. Forget about the even illegal part of poaching in terms of taking the skins off of tigers, as you can see in the picture. Just the issue is we just are using too many resources and mostly for money and not allowing those natural populations to recover over time. So that is the major ways that we impact the environment. HIPCO is the way to memorize it. Habitat destruction, invasive species, population growth, pollution, climate change, and overharvesting or overexploitation. And all of these cause a decrease in biodiversity that, if we don't stop, is going to eventually lead to major ecological disasters.